All right, well, we'll go and get started. We've got about an hour of time allotted for our discussion. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our roundtable. My name is Matthew Dempsey, and I'm an assistant teaching professor here at the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University. I'm really pleased to be the moderator for this very timely and important roundtable on the U.S. 2024 elections, a topic I'm sure we're all passionate about. We held a similar roundtable in 2022 for the midterms, and it was an engaging and lively discussion. So no pressure to the panelists, but I hope it's as engaging and lively as last time. So with Election Day 4 weeks away, as of yesterday, I think this discussion takes a heightened significance, making it really a critical and timely event. So thank you again for joining us. So now it's my honor to introduce our distinguished panel, all of whom are professors in ASU's Political Psychology Master's Program. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kim Fridkin. She's a foundation professor here at ASU, and she's the director of the Political Psychology Program. Next is Dr. Steve Newberg, also a foundation professor in the psychology department here at ASU, also the director of Psych for Life. We also have Dr. Fabian Neuner, an assistant professor and an expert in political psychology. So glad he could join us. And lastly, as I mentioned, I'm Dr. Matthew Dempsey, an assistant teaching professor here at ASU. I also worked in American politics for the past 8 years, and I can say I'm so glad I don't work in politics anymore, given the state of the election this year. So we have a fantastic set of panelists for you all. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Fridkin first, and then let the rest of the panelists speak for a minute or so to introduce themselves, and then we'll get to the questions. So Kim, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I'm Kim Fridkin, and I am, as Matthew said, the director of the Master's in Political Psychology program. We were just talking about this, but I think we launched in 2020, which was good in two ways. It was good because we're an online asynchronous program that came online during COVID. So that was good timing for us. It was also the 2020 election, which was very interesting election. So I think that was fortuitous. In terms of me, I do research on campaigns and elections, negative campaigning, women in politics. So this election is a good fit for me as well. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll turn it over to Steve for his introduction.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Steve Newberg. I've been here at ASU for a very long time. I think we were just talking about this a year longer than Kim, I believe. I'm one of the co-founders of the master's program, and within that program, I teach on politics and prejudices. One of my main areas of research is stereotyping, prejudice, intergroup conflict, and the like. And given that particular topic in this particular election, in fact, a lot of recent elections, politics and prejudice is very, very relevant. And so, toss it, I guess, to Fabian.
Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Fabian Neuner. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies, and it's great to be back. I was here in 2022, and it was a very enjoyable roundtable. So I study political psychology both in the US and in comparative contexts. So I like thinking about how this election is maybe different than other places. And often we talk about kind of the institutional rules, but today we're going to focus more on voter psychology, individual level differences, how people react to media. My own personal work really focuses a lot on race and race in politics and a lot on populism. And so I think those are both two topics that we'll maybe cover today, we'll maybe touch upon. So I look forward to our discussion.
All right, thanks so much. So I'm going to kick things off with a question just to get everyone warmed up. But for those of you listening in the audience, feel free to put your questions into the chat, and we'll largely be having an informal discussion here of your questions. I don't have 50 planned questions for us to go through. That'd be very boring. We want to address what you want to hear. So get those in the chat, and then I'll be selecting questions for our panelists to discuss. But to kick us off here, political psychology, for those who might not know, is a relatively new field of study. And a lot of our students, in fact, who get admitted to the program tell us that they never heard of political psychology until they began researching political science master's degrees. So, my first question to the panel then is, given the relative newness of the field, what role does psychology play in helping us understand perhaps American politics more broadly, or specifically the US 2024 elections? And whoever would like to kick it off may do so.
I could just start. And in my answer, I'll give a little bit more background about me. So probably too much, but anyhow, I've been interested in politics my entire life. I remember being in fifth grade and being really interested in, I'll date myself, but the Nixon-McGovern election. And then when I was a senior in high school was the 1980 election, where most of you will remember Ronald Reagan ran against Jimmy Carter. Most of you will not remember, well, you won't remember, you don't probably didn't even read it in history books, that there was a third party candidate by the name of John Anderson. So I was really interested in John Anderson's campaign. I worked for it in high school. I continued working for it when I went to Michigan.
That was my first election. That was my very first presidential vote, was for John Anderson.
Okay, there you go. So as a freshman at University of Michigan, I was like, why didn't everyone vote for John Anderson? So I was trying to figure out, and I was interested in psychology, figure out why people develop certain political attitudes. I didn't really understand what political science was at that point, but I knew what psychology was. So I was interested in understanding people's attitudes and what influences people's attitudes. And that's psychology. I mean, that's part of psychology. So I think it makes perfect sense. Then it makes even more sense now, because I think there's a lot of psychological predispositions that are maybe even more important now than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. So that's my kind of longish answer to that question.
I'll jump in, I guess. So, my quick and I don't know, a little bit snarky answer is everything about elections is psychology, right? It's barely anything but psychology, right? You've got individuals who are voting, and their psychology is it's about persuasion, and it's about values, and it's about commitments and identities and the like. You've got people donating money, and we can think about similar sets of goals that people are trying to accomplish with that. You've got candidates who are trying to achieve things, for communities, also for themselves. And I think, from top to bottom, most of what we're talking about is what's going on in people's heads and hearts that's driving their actions. Obviously influenced by structural things and other kind of perspectives as well, but it all comes in through the brain and then out through behavior back out into the world is my view. So I think we have an awful lot to offer. I think one of the fascinating things about this election is that it's so different in so many different ways, that it poses some interesting challenge for which of various different kinds of ways of thinking about it actually maybe most usefully apply here, and what exactly the specific lessons might be. But that's sort of, I'll stop there. And
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. So I think we'll talk a lot about partisanship today, probably, and we have psychological theories that help us understand why partisanship is such a kind of potent force in American politics, more so than maybe in other contexts. But on the other hand, we'll see this election, if you compare the presidential race or the polling in presidential races and the Senate races, you'll see there's often a gap between the presidential candidates and the senatorial candidates. And so I think partisanship can't be everything. And so I think a lot of what we'll be discussing today are individual level differences that might explain why people might vote for. It's not just how campaigns contact people, but what is it about people voting for certain candidates for federal office, but then for different candidates for the senators. And so I think, especially in a race where race and gender are going to be extremely salient, understanding those underlying attitudes, those underlying predispositions, it's going to be really helpful in understanding factors that affect and shape voting behavior that some people might not even be consciously aware about. So a lot of the work we do in political psychology is about because sometimes you can ask people why they vote for certain candidates, but usually in psychology, we don't really like people asking people why they do certain things because many times they don't know. And so I think a lot of the stuff we'll talk about today is about some of the implicit and automatic reactions people have that shape their political engagement.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Kim, not to make you feel old, but I wasn't even born when you were first voting.
You made me
Almost.
feel
I was
old. Thank
almost
you.
a wee lad. My first election was 2000, which as a first-time voter, that was a doozy of an election
Oh
to vote
yeah,
for the
yeah.
first time. I could almost argue every election of the 21st century, plus 2000, has been interesting. But we've got some great questions in the chat, or not. I shouldn't say the chat. I said that earlier, and I was lying to you. I'm so sorry. Fake news. Put your questions into the Q&A function. So we won't have live questions here. So Sonia, I see your hands raised. Please go ahead and just throw your question into the Q&A function, which you should see in the bottom menu of Zoom. But we already have a bunch of questions coming in, so I'll just throw them out and I'll answer some of them as we go. The first question I really like, which is which presidential candidate is more effective at tapping the emotional component in this election? Who wants to take it first?
I'll jump in. My sense is that they're both really effective. They're just tapping into different emotions, right? That I think, this is not one of these elections where people are, putting on their I don't know, their Mr. Spock hats and trying to figure out logically what sort of makes the greatest amount of sense and thinking through things in those kind of ways. I think there's an awful lot of emotion here tied to people's vulnerabilities and their desires and the like. And maybe I'll jump into that idea a little bit later because that's my particular hammer when I think a lot about a lot of things. And I just think it's different kinds of emotions. Although I have to say, I think both are I think both are reasonably good at engaging anger. I think maybe what Kamala Harris is doing as well is that she's engaging a kind of hope that goes along with some of that anger, and she's clearly been trying to do that, I think. Uh, but I think anger is actually a really big part of this particular election on both sides.
Yeah, I'll just add, just to follow up, and I agree with Steve. I think that there has, and I'm not sure whether it's just the way the campaign has evolved, but definitely there's a lot of enthusiasm on the Harris side, and I'm not sure whether, my point is, I don't know whether she's the one herself in her campaign generating it, or just what happened with Biden dropping out and Harris taking over, whether that's part of the enthusiasm. But I'm going to just tee up some things about emotions and let both Fabian and Steve maybe jump in. But different emotions do, my understanding, do different things for voters. And so both anger and enthusiasm, I think, both kind of, some of the research suggests motivates people to participate. But another emotion that Steve didn't raise is fear.
Here, that's right,
And
exactly right.
yeah, and I do think that a lot of Trump's rhetoric is directed at fear, fear of the other, fear of immigrants. Um, and fear does something else. It doesn't necessarily mobilize voters, but it encourages voters to maybe try to access more information, acquire more information about the campaign and the candidates. And I think some research suggests it might actually, I don't know if I want to say demobilize, but doesn't activate them. But I want to throw it open to my colleagues who've done more research about emotions than I have.
Yes, I mean, I'm starting to teach cognition emotions again, starting, I think, next week. So if you are taking that course, you will be analyzing a lot of ads, and we'll be talking about this a lot. And exactly the distinction between anger and anxiety is always a key one that we think about. Are people going to get mobilized by this? Or are people going to be less reliant on the partisanship? Are people going to, anxiety, we know, breaks people out of their partisan routines, makes them seek out new information, makes them more open to persuasion. But I think there's two other dynamics here that are really interesting. So on the one hand, it's not just about the emotion, but also about the issue. So we know that different campaigns want to make different issues more salient because they own those issues, they're stronger on those issues, and if those issues are being talked about, that is good for their campaign. So, and you could also think about the fact that if the Trump campaign, for instance, wants to make immigration the key issue, you don't make an enthusiastic ad about immigration. It's just fear and anger might be the things that happen there. And so maybe it doesn't matter as much there what the emotion is if you're managing to get that issue very central. But I also think in political psychology, especially in my class, we talk a lot about different theories of where emotions come from. And so there's different schools of thought. If it's something automatic, something kind of pre-conscious, where we have bodily reactions to a certain stimulus and that makes us react in a certain way, or whether we cognitively engage with what we see out in the world and then we interpret that information. And I think that's a really interesting question that we still go back and forth. And it is always in I think our class where we notice that different people will see the same ad and react in different ways. And so I think we're currently rethinking how to integrate the study of partisanship and emotional reactions, because if you just think of an emotion as having this automatic reaction, then just turn on your TV, watch a couple of ads, sit down with somebody from a different party, and figure out whether you feel the same emotions. And so I think we need to think a little bit more about this interaction between kind of our cognition and our which team we belong to or which team we root for, and how that makes us interpret information we see. Because I think it's not as black and white anymore that we just all react with the same emotional reaction to the same stimulus.
So let me actually build on this and maybe suggest at least one possible sort of resolution or way of thinking about that particular issue. You know, my particular hammer, my way of looking at the world is, I think the mind's job is fundamentally about identifying and managing the opportunities and threats out there in the world. Whether at a very perceptual level about whether this thing I'm about to sit on will hold my weight, to the kinds of people we're interacting with and what they afford us in terms of opportunities and threats. And what that means is that the exact same stimulus can be viewed depending on what one's goals and desires and needs, and in particular, in this case, vulnerabilities might be. So, for example, Trump is probably agreed upon by both supporters and those opposed as sort of having a pretty healthy disregard for conventional norms. Right. Well, for some groups of folks who sort of want to burn it all down, right? Sort of, Michael Bang Peterson's ideas of need for chaos and things like that. This is an opportunity, right? That disregard for conventional norms is an opportunity, which might lead to admiration and enthusiasm and those kinds of emotions. For those who value stability and order, conventional, traditional kind of values and the like, this is a humongous threat, right? And it is going to engage anxiety and fear, and then potentially disgust and contempt, but then also anger to potentially mobilize as one imagines what the costs are likely to be. You can think about Kamala Harris on the other side, right? She, in a lot of ways, is viewed as a conventional liberal, right? In some ways, that's an opportunity for those, for example, who seek to enhance diversity. I'll have to say that she might not be viewed as liberal enough for those who are very, very activist along that dimension. An opportunity of those who want policies, even if you disagree with those policies, to stay within sort of a range of normalcy, right? There's sort of not go beyond latitudes of acceptance into latitudes of rejection, even if they're on the wrong side of the spectrum for you. On the other side, a really significant threat by those who view liberal policies as being really dangerous for the future. And so the exact same features and characteristics of these candidates can lead to these very, very different sets of perceptions of opportunity and threat. And depending on what the threat is, you get different kind of negative emotions. Depending on what the opportunities are, different kinds of sort of positive emotions. And so maybe this motion variance that we sort of see out there is coming out of these frames where the same sort of base characteristic, where there's a lot of agreement, nonetheless is an opportunity for folks with certain vulnerabilities or desires, threats to those with certain kind of vulnerabilities.
Yeah,
Can I just
absolutely.
briefly add something to that? So I just want to mention, because Steve mentioned something that most viewers probably haven't heard of yet, and that's need for chaos. I'm just currently working with some colleagues to field a study where I'm trying to make sure that we keep some need for chaos questions in there. So the reason it's important is we've spoken about how people react to emotions, but we're also talking about individual level differences, how some people have different psychological profiles. And so need for chaos is like how much people want chaos in their lives. So for instance, the questions we ask to measure need for chaos are stuff like I get a kick out of natural disasters striking in foreign countries, or sometimes you just have to burn it all down. And so it's a scale of, I think, 8 questions that tries to get at people who have a worldview that they feel that way. And I think especially in this election, that might be really interesting, not just for candidate choice between Harris and Trump, but also why might people vote for third-party candidates? Why might people vote for a third-party candidate, even though they might let a less preferred candidate win in that case? And so some of these individual level factors might help us explain not just how people react to different campaign ads, but also how they might behave in ways that seem irrational if you don't take into account some of these kind of underlying attitudes or traits.
Yeah, exactly. Gosh, I don't know which questions to do next because there's two that spring directly from what we were just discussing. So, this question I particularly like, and it's a longer one, but it states a common argument we see is that people often vote, quote, against their own interests, end quote. White working classes voting for politicians that don't promote their economic well-being. How does a political psychology perspective advance our understanding of such patterns and whether such arguments are compelling? So I think Fabian was just touching on this. I'll tackle it first. One thing, to be honest, I've always been uncomfortable with is determining for another individual what their own best interests are. So, person A might prioritize economics in their vote. They want smaller government, lower taxes, so they're voting for conservatives in the United States no matter what. Other folks, though, social issues might be more important. Perhaps for a member of the LGBTQ plus community, their right to marry or affirmative health care is more important than a tax cut. And so I always caution my students to be careful in assuming what someone's best interests are. And usually the assumption is your best interest is your pocketbook, because I don't think that that's always the case. And as Steve and Fabian were just getting at, there are layers upon layers of what go into our vote decisions. And it's not always sort of a rational choice. I'm going to pick the optimum outcome on this variable only. But I'm definitely curious to hear what my other colleagues have to say.
Yeah, and I would build on that and Fabian's comments about individual differences is that you can think about situational differences which activate certain vulnerabilities or desire. I mean, those of us who are old enough remember that we were very, very close in the 2000 aughts to having a comprehensive immigration reform until the Great Recession hit. I mean, literally, I think weeks away from having from having a vote on that, and then all of a sudden, no one could support it anymore under economic threat. It became politically unfeasible, and so you think about the interaction of events which make certain kind of vulnerabilities more salient, particularly for certain folks, right? For folks who have certain kind of dispositions, certain kinds of economic standings, and the like. And I think that leads to a lot more variation in what people's interests actually are. And I think we make a mistake when we sort of do this kind of, as Matthew's mentioning, these sort of broad stroke inferences about what's in someone else's best interest. And I think when politicians are doing that, and you can tell that they're doing that by how they talk to us, right? It's insulting in certain kinds of ways to where they actually live.
Yeah, an example in this current election is I'm going to forget the union now that I'm talking about it. I want to say the Teamsters, but it might not be the Teamsters. But the Biden administration essentially bailed out their pension, and yet they can't decide on a candidate to endorse. And so many on the left are arguing, hey, we did this thing for you. Why are you not? And Trump is supposedly anti-union, so why are you voting against their interest? But clearly, there's a more complicated story here.
I want to make two points here, which I think are interesting. So the topic of immigration was mentioned, and so immigration is a great example where there's something that we sometimes forget, especially when we measure things. You can ask people, how much do you support immigration? A 5-point scale. And you'll have some people who support immigration and some people who don't support immigration. And then you have all of these variations, of course. But that doesn't really tell us how important that issue is to people. And a lot of research tells us that the people who are in favor of restricting immigration care about immigration a whole lot more than those people who are in favor of increasing immigration. And so you have to both take into account both where people are on the issue, but also how important that issue is to them. And I think that goes to the heart of this debate between your pocketbook and what we call symbolic politics. And I think now in this election, we really see symbolic politics at play. There was an article today about, either in the New York Times, Washington Post, about the amount of ads that were recently ran during football games on, I think, transgender bathrooms or related topics. And of course, for most people, it's not a salient issue in their lives. But the way it has been constructed as a narrative is something that is threatening to a certain identity. And so, what a lot of, I think, work comes back to is that our identities have been fused in ways that our partisan identity is a big part of our overall identity, which means that if that identity is threatened, then all of our other identities are also threatened. And so we kind of become hardened in our convictions. And I think what happens here is that we see symbolic threats to our identity. And so what happens here is that people believe that their way of life is threatened. And so this goes back to the original question here in terms of why might people vote against, quote unquote, their personal interest. And it's this idea that they think more about symbolic threats to their identity, where their identity is not directly linked anymore to their own voting intention. It happens if you ask people, how is the economy doing compared to how are you doing financially? People saying, well, yeah, they're doing fine financially, but the economy is doing really badly. And so I think it's this that we've divorced in a way our own identity from our pocketbook.
I have nothing really to add. I think
Okay.
that
Yeah,
covered
okay.
it
I
really
thought you
well.
were about that.
Sorry.
All right. Thank you so much. That's such a good question. Um, this is shifting gears just a little bit. But the question reads, how does this election year relate to the psychological theories of the wider world, between those who are right-leaning or left-leaning? Do certain global trends, such as the rise of certain political ideologies, influence our own elections? For example, more right-wing trends in Europe and elsewhere reflect more nationalist tendencies here in the US.
I'm going to throw that over to Fabian because I think that he has probably some thoughts about that.
I'm really sorry. I was trying to read the question at the same time as you were reading the question,
Oh,
and so some of this got lost in translation. And so if I can't speak directly to the question, I apologize. I'm happy to have people repost in the chat. But I think what we have to take into account is that globalization and globalized media flows have really changed the dynamics of politics. And if you think about who is coming to the US to campaign, you see Nigel Farage come, who is famous in the UK for the UK Independence Party and Brexit. You have Steve Bannon going to France to talk to people. So historically in the European Union, for instance, the problem always was that you would have 20 years ago, 15 years ago, nationalists or right-wing politicians from different countries coming together in the European Union. And then they couldn't get along because they were all nationalists. And so they were against each other in a way, even though they had the same overarching kind of nationalist beliefs. But nowadays, that's changed in a way that they have the same influences, the same global networks. Look at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference. You will have a lot of exchange between the right in the US with the right in Europe. And so there's a lot of money behind this in terms of creating ideological projects that are cross-national. And so that's why you see the same kind of themes pop up in different countries. Now, of course, the big difference is that as you might see right now, I'm originally from Austria. Austria had an election a week ago, maybe it was 2 weeks ago now, and where the far right became the strongest party, and there's like international uproar. How could this happen? But it was more or less the same 20 years ago, and it's just because it's a proportional representation system reaching 30% of the vote. And so the same kinds of voters exist in all of these different countries, just the electoral systems change whether they have to form coalitions, whether the party whether a more mainstream party gets captured by maybe more extreme elements. And so I think what we see here is now just a lot more kind of ideological learning across borders, and just these people are consuming the same media, these people are co-producing the same media, and so I think that's what's going on here.
Let me add another variable here. I think, in one line of my research, I focus a lot on how features of broader ecology, ship sort of psychological strategies and behavioral strategies that people, and in fact, all kind of organisms have. And I think there are maybe a couple things here that are common exposures, broad things. And I think one of them might have been economic uh, challenges created by COVID. But the other one, and related to this a little bit, is huge migration from sort of global south into global north, and the challenges that kind of migration has for nations and for culture and for perceptions of threats to values and to threats to economics and the like. And I think one of the things Europe is less so now, but way more homogeneous than the United States for a long time. And so these migration flows pose much greater challenges, I think, without a lot of practice and thinking about how to deal with them. I think a lot of the rise of the right has been largely have come about as a function of migration flows combined with sort of economic challenges. And so I think common circumstances may also be explaining some common political trends as well. A hypothesis.
Just so we've got about 30-ish minutes left. So in an effort to cover as many topics as possible, we're going to switch gears again. And this question to me is really related to social psychology. And the question reads, are you seeing more voters gravitating towards the recommendations of family and friends as opposed to trying to find information through research on the web? My very glib response is the assumption of this question is that people ever researched politics here in America to decide on who they're going to vote for. The more serious answer is people have never researched who they're going to vote for. I'm speaking in very broad terms here, but I know this word has been used a lot in 2024, but voters have long sort of voted based on vibes. Who is my group voting for, whether it's a racial group, sex or gender group, religious group. Partisanship is king in this country and always has been. But it's especially, I think, the case in modern elections that research, once you pick a party, you tend to vote for that party for life. And it's very difficult to persuade people out of that party. When I was working in politics, we had the adage, if we can get someone to vote for the same party 3 elections in a row, we've got them for life. Whether the data supports that is a different story, but it's what campaign folks think. And so I think we've long, if not always, relied on our friends and family or religious leaders or people in our community over doing our own research, whether that's online in the 21st century or the library or the newspaper in the 20th century. But I'd love to hear what the rest of you have to say.
I think it's an interesting question, and I'd like to see the data on this, right? I mean, there has been this notion in political science that, if you're raised in a Republican family, if you're raised in a Democratic family, those of us who were raised in mixed families, not clear what the implications, but I'm wondering now whether there's a cohort switch in terms of younger folks, not necessarily that some of the norms and some of the values seem to be shifting so fast, perhaps with social media, perhaps with threats posed by different kind of movements in the country. I'm not sure to what extent that young people, that kids are in fact looking to their parents and being driven by their parents in the same kind of way that maybe they were when I was growing up. Do any of you know are there any data on this?
I was reading an article earlier this week. One of my favorite political science studies, I think, is the one you're referencing, a longitudinal study that tracked kids through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s to see their partisanship. And for the most part, you're right, Steve, that kids are the party of their parents. I'm an exception. I am not the party of my parents, and I thought I was in high school, and then I was 18 in college and voted, and I was like, nope, I'm sure not. And I did research that year. But the article was saying that what you're hypothesizing, which is today, because of social media creating almost new families, that the traditional family is losing its hold on kids having the same partisanship as their parents. And so it seems to be decreasing from that study of the latter part of the 20th century.
Plus, there's probably a greater sense that your parents' generation, that my generation, has really sort of mucked stuff up pretty good, right? And there may be sort of a lack of trust along those lines too, in terms of, but just a hypothesis. Kim's about to say something.
I'm just going to say that I don't know. There's not very much political socialization research, I think, because it's so hard to do. Maybe Fabian knows some stuff that I don't, but I'm always encouraging my students to try to look at that because it is a really important question about what do kids as their, I would say you have to start earlier than the Jennings-Nemi study is the one that you're talking about. They started high school seniors. I think we have to start like at least in middle school. But I do think the way people get their news, and it's not that they're doing research. I think Matthew, I think it's just where they live in terms of their exposure to different news sources and different social media streams, and a lot of people are accidentally coming into information about politics, and I think that is influencing them, especially probably younger people. In terms of social media, older people though, in terms of like Fox News versus MSNBC. So I think the diversity of agents, socialization agents, is so much greater today than it was in the past, and I think it's really difficult to measure, but it makes everything, I think, a little bit more complicated.
Let me make one other really quick comment about we presume when we think about kids and parents that the influence is a socialization process. But let's not forget that there's actually a decent heritability, genetic heritability of political attitudes and preference. And parents and kids are often growing up in the same ecology with the same kind of pressures, same environments, same kind of pressures, which might lead to the same kind of voting inclinations as well.
I wanted to just provide one overarching kind of way to think about this, and that's heuristics. That's something we think a lot about. So people don't spend a lot of time doing research, even if we think they would, but they use a number of shortcuts to kind of simplify the space. So partisanship is just often one heuristic. It's like, I know what this party stands for, and so it gives me a quick shortcut to figure out which of these two politicians will I be more likely to support. We think about linked fate, sometimes called the black utility heuristic, this idea that in the African American community, people are more likely to vote for Democrats because they feel like what will be better for the group as a whole. And again, it's a shortcut, it's a heuristic. And so trusting family members is just a heuristic. It's like if you have people in your life that you trust, that you think are making good decisions, that you think are sound about politics, then you will follow their lead because it's easier than kind of doing all the research yourself. It's like you can trust someone. That's why endorsements work. And so I think that gives us a framework to think about all of these things we just mentioned, like religious leaders, but give us some language to talk about that. The other thing I want to highlight here is one of my favorite recent books in political psychology called The Other Divide by Yana Krupnikov and John Barry Ryan. And it's this idea that we know what the big divide is, Democrats and Republicans, but there's this other divide that we sometimes don't really talk about, and that's between those people who are highly engaged in politics and those who aren't. And so by virtue of you being on this Zoom call, you're probably in the camp of people who care about politics, who think about politics, and who think that most other people think about politics. But in reality, many people don't. And so sometimes we have to break out of this idea that people are out there doing their own research, they care about politics. And so then it goes back to a lot of these other questions we've been thinking about in terms of how people make up their mind to vote. It's like, is there one issue that they really care about? Do they care about student loans? Do they care about gun rights? Is there one issue that then kind of transforms them into voters that grabs their attention? And so for those people, these traditional heuristics might not work because there might be one single issue that gets to them. And we actually see a lot of the discourse over the last 2 weeks, or actually over the last 3 or 4 days, has been, how do you reach those voters? A lot of the ideas of the podcast that the Harris campaign went on, or the podcast that the Trump campaign goes on. Okay, how can you reach those people who don't really care about politics? And if you talk to them about politics, they won't want to engage with you. But if you meet them where they're at and you inject politics into their life, then maybe they will find something that resonates with them. And so I think thinking a little bit more about those people who don't like live politics is kind of important to do as well.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I was reading a poll this morning that showed in the most politically engaged, Harris is ahead nationwide. But if we look at those, meaning those who habitually vote, whereas those who infrequently vote, Trump is ahead. And so the panel's exactly right in that Trump's, I think, job is to get those infrequent voters out. And if he can, he may conceivably win the election, at least if he can get those people out in swing states. California, man, probably doesn't matter. The Harris's campaign, on the other hand, interestingly, might be she doesn't want higher turnout. She doesn't want those infrequent voters entering the pool. And so this leads me to my next question. And a lot of them in the chat or in the question function are about ads. So we're going to return to that a little bit, but I do think this is relevant to the current discussion. And that is the ad campaigns are remarkably different. The Harris campaign is a mix of positive and negative. The Trump campaign is nearly entirely negative. Why? Candidate or voter psychology, or something about larger messages such as conservative populism and traditional liberalism, all of the above.
I guess I could start. I don't know the answer. I think one answer is just that Harris and Trump are different in terms of the amount of information people have about them, right? So Trump has been president. It's the third time he's running for president. Harris just came on. I mean, she was VP, but people didn't know very much about her, so they don't have that much information. So she needs to continue to introduce herself to the electorate. You do that with positive ads. Trump doesn't need to introduce himself. For a project that I'm doing, I'm actually was trying to look for some positive ads from both candidates. I could only locate two ads from Trump the entire campaign that are positive. There's comparative ads, but in terms of positive ads. So that's one reason. Another is just structurally, um, is that the Harris campaign has a lot of money, and so they could continue to run positive ads as well as run negative ads because as Matthew knows, because Matthew did a dissertation on negative campaigning. But campaigns go through kind of a cycle. They start positive and then they move to more negative by this point in the campaign. So I think it's relatively rare for there to be as many positive ads as there are from Harris. So I think it's mainly, I think, because people need to know more about her and they're saying that they do. I'm not sure that I think some of that is masking other things. Maybe uh, people are hesitant about voting for a black woman for president, and so they need to know lots of information. But anyhow, that's just kind of to get you guys started. But those are my initial reactions.
Let me build off that last point. I mean, first of all, they're two very different people with very different kind of just general demeanors and affects. But I do think there is with Harris, there's a real cost for women not coming across as warm. And so there needs to be a kind of positive, right? There's for there's a little bit of a tension between warmth and competence as a simplification or whatever. For women to not come across as warm is a very, very dangerous thing, I think, in politics and in leadership positions in general. And so I think the fact that they're continuing as it's also the beginning of the of her campaign as well as the end of her campaign, which makes it a little bit of a challenge there too in terms of conventional strategy. But I think the notion of having to continue the warmth thing and especially countering, the negativity of the ads, which often are not just about these horrible things that our policies and our decisions have made, but the visuals there are showing an angry or often showing sort of a well, I'm gonna pull back on that one. I'm not sure I'm right about that. If we would do the kind of analysis that Kim might be doing. Uh, yeah, I think it's hard for a woman not to come across not as warm and still be successful.
So Kim, if Joe Biden was still running for president, do you suspect he would be running mostly negative ads similar to Trump?
Yeah. I think if we looked at 2020, that's probably what was happening about this time. I will just add a little bit to what Steve was saying. He's basically identifying the double bind that women candidates face. So people do have, they still, even today, have these gender stereotypes about what's appropriate for women versus men. And so women have like an advantage in terms of like empathy and compassion, but have a disadvantage in terms of strength and leadership. And when they try to demonstrate their strength and leadership, they may be hurting people's views of their warmth, as you were saying. So that is kind of a delicate balance that Harris is trying to make, and that could account for some of the positivity. But you see it even with like the I have a gun, and if someone was coming in my house, I would shoot that person. I mean,
With
there's
a smile.
with a smile,
She's
yeah. And a little laugh,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
But I think there's an interesting point here because Kim mentioned how um, the use of negativity shifts around the campaign, but you also want to see this in conjunction with the emotions. So we know that, for instance, if you run negative campaigns early on in the campaign, negative ads that are meant to make people anxious, then they might reevaluate their candidate choice. They might switch vote choice. So that's maybe negativity early on. Whereas if it comes to the last 2 weeks of the election, if you're using negative ads, you're trying to demobilize potentially your opponent. You're trying to say, well, there's people who would normally vote for Harris, for instance, but you're going to try and see if there's something that sticks to get that person not to turn out. So negativity can have two different purposes at different times in the campaign. Is it just to try and persuade someone, or is it just kind of a last-ditch effort to find something that that person will give them a reason not to vote for the candidate and maybe not vote at all?
And to vote for your candidate. So the combination of mobilizing your own folks and demobilizing the others.
Yeah, and the elections of the 21st century have increasingly become base elections. Democrats are just trying to turn out democratically inclined voters and not speak to the middle, and the same is true of the other side. And this tees up the next question, very related, which is: do you think fear or hope is more effective at increasing turnout? And I will add, or maybe a combination of both.
Hmm.
But which emotion is more potent?
I mean, just based on the articles I teach my students, I think the in the literature, the argument would be that hope and enthusiasm are mobilizing emotions, and fear, the research is a lot more mixed. We know that fear has a number of downstream consequences like reevaluation, less reliance on partisanship. When it comes to actual mobilization, I would say that enthusiasm is, especially when we talk about base mobilization, that enthusiasm and hope ads are going to be more mobilizing than fear ads.
Are there data on for whom that's the case? I mean, I would think that that might be especially the case for younger kind of voters, folks who are still clinging to idealism and the like. And my guess here is that getting out the youth vote is going to be advantageous for Harris in this particular election, especially with some of the issues on the ballot having to do with inclusiveness, having to do with abortion, uh, uh, and the like. That hope ads will be very important for getting that young demographic out for her.
Um, Kim alluded to my dissertation earlier ago, which nightmare. So thanks for bringing it up. But what I specifically looked at were negative ads more effective or positive in response to an initial attack ad, or what did I call them? Now I'm having a brain fart. But ads that were both positive and negative. Steve mentioned them earlier. And I think we see a lot of those types of ads these days where you kind of hit the opponent at first. So it seems like it's a negative ad, but it ends up being, and here's what I want to do to fix the issue. So these more contrast ads than purely negative or purely positive. And generally speaking, the results of my research and that of others is negative ads are still pretty potent at moving folks, which is why politicians use them. They are rational actors to a degree. If negative ads didn't work, they wouldn't be running them. But contrast ads tended to be more powerful than a pure positive or a pure negative. And interestingly, in my own research, pure positive ads didn't move anyone at all. We sort of expect politicians to kiss babies and eat apple pie. And so when you have a commercial saying you kiss babies at the parade and eat apple pie, we're like, okay, well, I'd expect that of a politician. So if you say my opponent is bad on this, but here's how I want to fix it, those ads are particularly effective. And so I think perhaps a mix of emotions or what you're trying to trigger in an ad might be the way to go.
Are you including in positive ads there, sort of vision ads? Because I think that's one of the things that Harris has been focusing. I mean, the positive ads, the hope ads, are sort of visions for an America, right? And I think that's sort of been her approach on the positive side. I don't know if they work the same as other kind of positive ads with me hanging out with my family with.
But positive ads also could be issue ads, right? This is my position, or this is what I've done for this issue, or whatever. So there's a wide variety. So you raise a good point. I don't think that Matthew distinguished between different types of positive ads. I'm not sure that we know. I think we think that these kind of vision ads, like Reagan's Morning in America, right? People think that those types of ads are important. Or are effective. I don't know the empirical evidence. I will, just going back to negativity, because Pat Kenny and I have worked on this for a long time. A couple things that we haven't really brought up in terms of negative ads. One is the civility of the negative ads. So negative ads can vary a great deal in terms of how uncivil or civil they are. And the second dimension that we think is important in terms of the ad itself is how relevant it is for the person who's watching the ad. So that's important. But also people vary in terms of their tolerance for negativity. And so all of these three factors are important in trying to figure out whether people are going to learn, whether people are going to be demobilized or mobilized. So for example, if there's a lot of ads that are uncivil and aren't relevant for people, that may lead people to stay home, especially people who are intolerant of negativity. So I think it's complicated, and there's a lot of factors to consider when trying to figure out the impact of negative ads.
It shows the value. I mean, there's a multiple audience problem that we have now, especially, right? Because everything can end up everywhere, right? At the same time, you can go to these, the media is segmented too, and if, to the extent that people stay in one. But in the olden days, it was way easier to sort of tailor your messages a lot more. You go to this town hall over here, you'd be doing this over here, doing this over here. That gets a lot harder, which makes the complexity of all these factors coming in makes it more difficult to take those and make strong predictions.
Absolutely. I think we've got time for one more question. And so this one reads, with Harris entering the race as late as she did, does that make any difference on whether the campaigns themselves matter in this election? I can tell this person has had my class. Even though this cycle seems crazy and different, it still feels somewhat similar to other recent elections, which would make me inclined to believe that campaigns still won't really do anything to move the margins. So classic political science question, do campaigns matter? So just to update it, does this election actually matter, or are we just going to fall back on typical partisan positions?
Campaigns matter. Pat and I just published a book about how campaigns matter. They matter.
What was it called? It was called Campaigns Matter?
No, but they matter in the margins, right? I mean, yes, there's people who are strong Republicans, they're probably going to vote Republican. People who are strong Democrats are going to vote Democrat. There are, like in Arizona, for example, a third of the voters are independents, or other is how they're categorized in Arizona. That's a lot of people. Now, some of them are probably like kind of closet partisans, but some of them are not. Some of them are, like we talked about before, they're not that interested in politics. So we're not sure exactly how they're going to be affected. But I would say that campaigns matter in the margin. I hypothesize that this campaign in some ways will matter more because the voter knows so much less about Harris, and it was such a truncated campaign. So although we saw that, I mean, I think that the debate between Trump and Harris actually did matter. I think the DNC, the convention mattered. It didn't, it's not going to be like a 10-point difference. We're too evenly divided as a country. So I think we just have to look at kind of the margins. And I would argue, but I'll let the rest of you argue something different. I would argue that campaigns matter in terms of affecting kind of the margin of victory.
I think there's one other dimension here. So there's been some recent meta-analyses of kind of campaign ads, and campaigns are much more than just campaign ads. And maybe campaign ads will cancel each other out. But think about small margins. So right now, thinking about early voting is a fool's errand unless you're one certain guy in Nevada who knows it very well. But like in Pennsylvania right now, we're talking about like the return rate of mail ballots and what the difference is between Democrats and Republicans. And so their campaigns do matter. Like if you have a strong campaign who can track who is voting and they know where to put resources, they know in whose door they need to vote because that person reliably voted the last 4 elections and suddenly hasn't voted yet, they can target that voter, then campaigns really do matter. And so I think a lot of when this election is done, there will be a lot of stories probably about the ground game and get out the vote efforts and ballot chasing efforts. And that's where I think campaigns really matter. At those margins, at not a persuasion, but at making sure the people you want to vote actually turn out and vote.
I almost hate to admit it as a former campaign person, but I don't think campaigns matter all that much. So I'm going to respectfully disagree with Kim, although I really don't disagree all that much. I think they certainly don't matter to the degree that the average American would think that they matter. I think that y'all are right, that they matter on the margins. And if the campaign has enough resources to take advantage of the data we can now have with modern campaign tools to target that type of voter that always votes but hasn't yet, then that campaign, if they've got the staff, the resources, can reach out to that person. But if the campaign doesn't have those resources, then I mean, there's no campaign, I suppose. So I think the surprising finding of a lot of political science or psychology literature is that campaigns don't matter much, but they do matter, but in ways the common sense would not predict that they would matter. That was a horrible sentence. But the ways the media, the talking heads, the cable news shows tell us campaigns matter, that's not what it's about. And so they matter in very small ways, especially because, as Kim was saying, we're so partisan now. Even independents aren't independent. Recent data suggests only 12% of those who claim to be independent are actually independent, and they don't really vote anyway. Everyone else claiming to be independent, that's 88%, are closet partisans, as Kim was alluding to. It's simply a label and not really a reality. And so campaigns, if they have the ability to figure out who's what, like who are these closet partisans, they could perhaps matter more, but that's difficult to do. Steve, any thoughts here? And it's okay.
I guess I have an intuition and no data. I'm wondering whether the so-called independents who you think are closet partisans are folks who are more likely to split vote, and that is that there might be soft partisans in a kind of way and be more likely to split vote. I saw there's a question about that, and I suspect that the presidential election in the state is going to be a lot closer than the senatorial election because of a lot of independents sort of splitting, going Democrat for Gallego and going Republican for Trump, but.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I know 2016 was the first time in American history where the party that won the presidency in a state also won the Senate seat. That had never happened up until meaning if a Democrat won president, a Republican Senate candidate would win, or vice versa. 2016 was the first time it didn't happen. Also didn't happen in 2020. So it seems as if straight ticket voting is on the rise. It doesn't mean some independents aren't splitting their ticket, but we seem less and less likely to as elections are becoming more nationalized. With that said, we are right at 1 o'clock Pacific time on the hour. So sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. An hour is a short time, and there were so many good questions in the chat. I think I can speak for all of us on the panel and say if you've got questions you'd like answered, email us. You can find us in the ASU directory. Just Google our names. I'm sure we're more than willing to respond to your questions. Thanks to all of those who joined us. We hope that this was an informative chat. And, when we do these again, we look forward to seeing you then.
Bye. Thank you.